Sup, chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. Well, when I decided to do an updated video on 5-AR blockers and neurosteroids, I didn't expect it to turn into a full-blown trilogy, but maybe Tolkien thought the same thing when he started writing Lord of the Rings. Heaven knows what George Lucas would have done with Star Wars if he could have possibly envisioned how it actually turned out. Truth be told though, this is actually a part 5 video for me because I made 2 previous videos on finasteride and neurosteroid, and I'll link all of them below. Anyways, in the first video, I talked about how animal studies on brain neurosteroids don't apply to humans. It is because of differences in dosing in animals versus humans, and because of interspecies differences in the effects of 5-AR blockers on the different 5-AR isoenzymes. Even taking into account factors like the metabolism differences between a human and a mouse, the dosage differences between organisms in these studies is still dozens, if not hundreds of times higher than equivalent doses in human beings. Also, in rodents, finasteride is a powerful blocker of the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme, which is more active in the brain, whereas in humans, finasteride's effect on the type 1 isoenzyme is extremely negligible. So considering the dosage differences, as well as the different responses to 5-AR blockers in animals versus humans, it is clear that animal studies cannot be used to draw conclusions about the effects of 5-AR blockers on neurosteroids in humans. Of course, this hasn't stopped corrupt doctors on the PFS network's payroll like Dr. Trash and Dr. Irwig from exploiting this data, but the fact is that all the cumulative human data during clinical trials, as well as follow-up data, has proven that finasteride and dutasteride are safe, and the only reason side effects like depression were even added to the package insert of finasteride to begin with was to mitigate threats of litigation based on anecdotal reports from online hysteria, which I went into great detail in my last video on the subject, which again you can check out below if you haven't seen it yet. In that video, I showed how 5-AR blockers through their effect on lowering the trash hormone DHT can actually improve androgen-related mental health problems such as Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, and even Tourette's syndrome. So make sure you watch those videos if you haven't yet, but the underlying point I'm trying to make here is that contrary to what finasteride-hating neckbeards and incels like to claim all the time, finasteride is in fact a neuroprotective drug that benefits the brain. It is not harmful in the slightest. So, besides these androgen-related mental health problems that finasteride helps alleviate, there are other additional mental disorders that have been shown to possibly be treatable through the use of 5-AR inhibitors. One of these is the intriguing possibility that 5-AR blockers may be useful in treating substance addiction, like alcoholism and opioid addiction. Now, I know right now every finasteride hater is going to go through their cherry-picked research folder to link the terrible study from our good friend Dr. Irwig, who is second only to Dr. Trash in the number of garbage anti-finasteride studies he's published. This article by Dr. Irwig claims that people on finasteride lose their taste for alcohol, which at first glance you may interpret as a positive outcome, which it is, but Dr. Irwig can't help but show his true colors when he tries to twist this as being a negative outcome of finasteride use. Just like the rest of Dr. Irwig's PFS network's approved research, the methodology of his study is absolutely atrocious. So, what Dr. Irwig did here is that he took 63 men with supposed post-finasteride syndrome and asked them if they noticed any effect on their alcohol consumption. A whopping 65% of them said that they noticed a decrease in their alcohol consumption at some point after they took finasteride. 32% had no change in their alcohol consumption, and 3% had an increase in alcohol consumption. So, analyzing this initially positive-looking data, Dr. Irwig noted that there are some rodent studies showing decreased alcohol consumption after finasteride. But like I pointed out in my previous video, in rodents, finasteride blocks both the type 1 and type 2 isoforms of the 5-AR isoenzyme, and the type 1 enzyme is predominant in the brain. However, in humans, finasteride blocks primarily the type 2 isoenzyme, so you can't extrapolate rodent studies on neurosteroids in the brain to humans. Despite this, Dr. Irwig irresponsibly jumps to the conclusion that the changes in alcohol consumption were due to finasteride's effects on neurosteroids, even though finasteride's effects on rodent brains are different than in human brains. Dr. Irwig then goes on to note that, quote,
"Many of the subjects in the study suffered from depressive symptoms as assessed by the Beck Depression Inventory 2, and some anecdotally reported that this led them to drink less as they participated in fewer social activities that involved alcohol. In addition, episodes of binge and heavy drinking have been shown to decline in the third decade of life, a time period that overlaps with the ages of many of the subjects in the study." Unquote.
So Dr. Irwig just admitted here that his study doesn't prove anything, and there are other reasons besides finasteride as to why the subjects adjusted their alcohol intake. Also, as is standard with all anti-finasteride research, there was no control group, and it was just a retrospective analysis where even if there was reduced alcohol consumption, there's no way to say this was caused by any previous finasteride use. Also, even if Dr. Irwig is right and finasteride does reduce alcohol cravings, why in the hell is that a bad thing? Alcohol is a recreational drug that causes a tremendous amount of health problems, both due to its hepatotoxic nature as well as its likelihood to cause risky behavior in its users, such as driving under the influence or unsafe sexual practices. If finasteride really does reduce alcohol cravings, which this study doesn't prove in the slightest, then that is a good thing. Yet here we have Dr. Irwig trying to spin these results as proving that finasteride has effects on neurosteroids in the brain that lead to behavioral problems and changes, which could validate the claim about finasteride affecting neurosteroids and causing the fake condition known as post-finasteride syndrome. Fortunately, though, we have a much better study on the effect of 5-AR inhibitors on alcohol abuse than this Dr. Irwig study that doesn't prove anything other than the fact that Dr. Irwig, just like Dr. Trash, is a hack in the medical community and a sellout to the goddamn PFS network. So here is a much better study on the same subject, and this time it involves dutasteride. It is titled, quote, Dutasteride reduces alcohol's sedative effects in men in a human laboratory setting and reduces drinking in the natural environment, unquote. So this study is from the NIH, and it was a randomized controlled study, which is a study design concept as foreign to the PFS Foundation as a lifestyle without Twinkies and Mountain Dew is to Jason Blaha. Also, you'll notice from the title that the investigators are using dutasteride and not finasteride as the study drug. So why is that? Well, the theory is that the neurosteroid allopregnanolone is elevated in periods of severe alcohol intoxication, and so decreasing neurosteroid synthesis might counteract the effects of alcohol use. The reason the investigators chose dutasteride and not finasteride for this study is because finasteride at normal clinically used doses does not have any effect on the type 1 isoenzyme. And like I said before, the predominant 5-AR isoenzyme in the brain is the type 1 isoenzyme. Dutasteride, on the other hand, has about 100 times the blocking power on the type 1 isoenzyme compared to finasteride. In fact, the authors of the study even state, quote, Type 2 5-AR is the predominant form in the prostate and skin. It's also present in the liver, but not in the brain, unquote. So as you just heard, the 2,5-AR isoenzyme doesn't even exist in the brain. Yet despite this, you constantly hear losers on hair loss forums complain about finasteride and neurosteroids. It happens every single day. So it's easy to fall claim to these emotional arguments. But if you just do a little research like I just did, it's easy to see why these people making these neurosteroid claims are completely full of shit. Yet another good reason to stay completely away from hair loss forums. So anyways, delving deeper into this quality research I found, there is good evidence that the type 2 5-AR isoform, which finasteride inhibits, isn't even present in the brain at all. In fact, there are several studies that analyze 5-AR isoenzymes in the human brain, and I'll link them below. But here's a quote from the results of one of those studies. Quote, conclusively, 5A reductase 2 mRNA is not expressed in the human temporal lobe, unquote. In another study, 5AR activity in the human brain was analyzed after finasteride and after something called MK386, which is a specific and very powerful 5AR type 1 blocker, kind of like a super dutasteride. But before you get too excited, it's worth mentioning that it doesn't have any effect on the type 2 isoenzyme, which is the one that is important for hair loss. In this figure, the squares are control 5AR activity, the white circles are finasteride, and the black circles are MK386. Finasteride had only weak effects on 5AR, while MK386 shut down 5AR completely. If there was type 2 5AR in the brain, MK386 would not have shut down 5AR completely. The fact that finasteride had a small effect on 5AR was due to finasteride's very weak type 1 blocking activity, which remember is only 1/100th of dutasteride's. It had nothing to do with its effects on blocking the type 2 isoenzyme. So all this data indicates that it's only the type 1 isoenzyme that produces neurosteroids in the brain, and therefore there's nothing to worry about regarding finasteride's effects on brain neurosteroid levels. This is why in this study they chose dutasteride instead of finasteride, since as we know, finasteride only suppresses 1/100th the type 1 5-AR isoenzyme compared to dutasteride. So with that in mind, what effect does dutasteride have on drinkers? Well, In the study, 70 men got either a single dose of 4 milligrams of dutasteride, which is 8 times the standard dose, or they got a placebo pill. After this, each man was given either a stiff drink or a non-alcoholic cocktail. The investigators measured the levels of a metabolite of DHT and unsurprisingly found that this metabolite decreased by 73%, which just reflects dutasteride's extremely strong effect of blocking the 5-AR enzyme and reducing the trash hormone DHT. As far as the effects of alcohol, dutasteride significantly reduced the sedative effect of alcohol, making it less potent. Not only that, the investigators surveyed the subjects 4 weeks after they received the dutasteride dose, and amongst the heavy drinkers, there was decreased alcohol consumption, though drinkers who took the placebo drug did not have any change in their drinking habits. Also, dutasteride had no effect on drinking habits in light drinkers. So in the case of dutasteride, it's possible it does have a slight effect on neurosteroids, but keep in mind, these subjects were using 4 milligrams of dutasteride, and the effect on the urge to drink only affects subjects who are already very, very heavy drinkers, and thus probably already had abnormally high levels of neurosteroids due to the proven link between alcohol consumption and elevated neurosteroid levels. The point is, though, these neurosteroid fluctuations from dutasteride are of no concern because most people will just be using 0.5 milligrams of dutasteride. The highest dose of dutasteride ever used in studies about hair loss in human beings is 2.5 milligrams per day. And even at that dose, it is still well tolerated and proven to be effective and safe, which I discussed in my dutasteride dosing video, which I'll link below. So, it looks like dutasteride might be a useful drug to reduce the urge to drink in alcoholics, but like I said, the study showed no effect of dutasteride on the urge to drink in light or moderate drinkers. Finasteride, on the other hand, not being a type 1 blocker, wouldn't have any effect on alcohol's toxic effects or alcohol consumption. So I think Dr. Irwig was just telling the lawsuit-hungry PFS network what they wanted to hear. He's probably hoping to share in the spoils of all their lawsuits against Merck based on the bullshit fake condition known as post-finasteride syndrome. So fighting alcohol addiction is great. It's yet another reason to love 5-AR inhibitors. But earlier, you may remember I also mentioned opioid addiction. Well, we do have some data on that, although unfortunately, it does have the limitation of being just an animal study. The study used not just rats, but also, interestingly enough, it used zebrafish. So these poor animals were subjected to doses of hydrocodone, morphine, and fentanyl in the name of science. Opioid addiction kills up to 50,000 Americans a year, and unfortunately, the best treatment we have for it at the moment is methadone, which is also an addictive opioid. So it's almost like treating a cigarette addiction by switching to vaping. We clearly need better treatments than this. So anyways, the study is titled, quote, "The 5A reductase inhibitor finasteride reduces opioid self-administration in animal models of opioid use disorder," unquote. Like I mentioned, the main part of the study used zebrafish that were addicted to hydrocodone. That's the same stuff that Rush Limbaugh was addicted to, although he was also addicted to cigars, which is probably why he died of lung cancer, or maybe it was just from a broken heart after seeing Trump lose re-election. I mean, who knows? Anyways, the investigators took the fish and first put them in a bath with whatever drug they wanted to test for its addictive properties. They then went to an aquarium where there were 2 buttons they could push with their noses. One button delivered to them a dose of hydrocodone, the other button did nothing. So the investigators tested 110 different drugs on these fish, and guess which one actually worked? That's right, it was finasteride. If you look at the blue rectangles in this graph, you see that methadone reduced the number of times the fish went after their hydrocodone fix, but finasteride worked even better than methadone. The next graph here shows that the higher the dose of finasteride, the better it worked at reducing the cravings for opioids. Also, finasteride didn't have any effect on the fish's appetite or any other behavioral effects at all because unlike methadone, finasteride is not a narcotic. The investigators found similar results when they substituted dutasteride for finasteride, and they found similar results using morphine and fentanyl, suggesting that 5-AR inhibitors work for different kinds of opioids. They also found similar results in rats. When they gave morphine-addicted rats naloxone, which is an opioid blocker and causes acute opioid withdrawal symptoms, these withdrawal symptoms were much less in the rats who got finasteride versus the control rats, as you see in this figure right here. The investigators then tried to determine the mechanism of the effect. The most significant changes they saw in the steroids affected by the 5-AR blockade were an increase in a steroid called DHEAS and a decrease in another steroid called DHEA. These steroids seem to be out of whack in opioid-addicted animals, and finasteride would turn them back towards normal. It's interesting that both these steroids are actually precursors to testosterone and DHT, so it was the effect of finasteride on the precursors to the androgens that was important. It wasn't because of its effect on DHT and neurosteroids like allopregnanolone. The investigators admit that the doses used were much higher than human doses. They say, quote, "The optimal human dose for opioid use disorder would also have to be determined. The finasteride doses we used in rats are considerably higher than the dose regimens of 1 to 5 milligrams per day used in humans for alopecia and benign prostatic hyperplasia respectively," unquote. So this is a very interesting article suggesting that there might be some beneficial treatment regimen using finasteride or dutasteride that could be devised to treat opioid addiction, though it might take much higher doses than the doses used for androgenic alopecia or even benign prostatic hyperplasia in order to accomplish this. But it does prove that at lower doses, 5-AR inhibitors do not have any effect on neurosteroids. Much larger doses have to be used, and thus any theoretical neurosteroid effect would not apply to someone using a 5-AR inhibitor for the treatment of hair loss. Obviously, we will need human studies to verify if 5-AR inhibitors can actually help treat opioid-addicted people, but this would be a big breakthrough for a very serious problem in the United States and throughout the world for that matter, so hopefully we'll start seeing some human data in order to better confirm this. So, let's finish up with a couple of studies looking at some other therapeutic effects of 5-AR blockers in the brain. The first study is titled, quote, "5A reductase inhibition prevents the luteal phase increase in plasma allopregnanolone levels and mitigates symptoms in women with premenstrual dysphoric disorder," unquote. So premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, is associated with a lot of miserable symptoms in women, and it occurs in what's called the late luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. During this phase, there is an increase in the neurosteroid allopregnanolone, so anyone who wants to tell me allopregnanolone is a good thing, you've probably never lived with a woman with PMS, so don't tell me how great allopregnanolone is for your brain. Based on the fact that dutasteride has 5-AR type 1 isoenzyme blocking effects, the investigators decided to see if dutasteride would reduce the symptoms of PMS in women, and designed a randomized control trial, which again is the anathema of the PFS network. The researchers used both low-dose dutasteride at 0.5 milligrams per day and high-dose dutasteride at 2.5 milligrams per day. So these are doses more in line with what people would actually use for hair loss. Anyways, the investigators found that the low-dose dutasteride had no effect, but the higher dose did reduce PMS symptoms such as irritability, anxiety, and sadness. At the same time, high-dose dutasteride prevented the increase in allopregnanolone and increased progesterone levels during the PMS phase. So here we have a study where dutasteride has a beneficial effect on neurosteroids, but this was only seen with higher doses of dutasteride, although there are some people who do use 2.5 milligrams of dutasteride for hair loss effectively and safely. Also, this treatment does have some limitations, as the study authors point out, because women with PMS are of childbearing age, and so there is some risk to the fetus if they become pregnant, since 5-AR inhibitors should not be used by pregnant women because of the risk of birth defects. But this study points out that if there are any effects on neurosteroids from 5-AR blockers, the effects can actually be beneficial. Finally, I found an interesting study on the use of finasteride in treating a terrible brain tumor called glioblastoma. Here's the article. Unfortunately, glioblastoma is a virtually incurable brain tumor that you might remember the US Senator John McCain had, and chemotherapy doesn't do very much at all in improving survival. The investigators in the study tried out finasteride because of its effects on shrinking prostate size in people with benign prostatic hyperplasia. To me, this seems like a long shot, but some earlier studies had suggested that finasteride might be useful against this brain tumor, so the investigators took a deep dive into this subject. These investigators found that finasteride worked better than TMZ, which was the standard chemotherapy for treating glioblastoma. However, they had to use concentrations of finasteride much higher than those used normally in humans, actually about 1,000 times higher than normal. At these levels, they found that finasteride acted as an intracellular antioxidant, and this reduced the out-of-control beta-catenin levels in the tumor cells that was driving their growth. So this has nothing to do with finasteride's effects on 5-AR or DHT or even neurosteroids, because these are effects seen at concentrations of finasteride that you would never see at normal doses. But we're talking about fighting cancer here, so these are desperate measures. The investigators felt that the infusion of finasteride directly into these brain tumors might turn out to be more effective than standard chemotherapy, which is considered the gold standard for the treatment of this tumor. So this article was pretty recent. It was published last year, in fact, so we'll have to see if this becomes becomes a practical treatment for glioblastoma, but if it does, that will be an absolute breakthrough in medicine that could save thousands of lives per year, so I hope we see more research into the subject in the future. So, we've gone over a lot here, Choom, so let's summarize the last 3 videos on the effects of 5-AR blockers on the brain. First of all, I showed the type 1 5-AR isoform is the predominant isoform in the brain, and that in humans, finasteride is not a type 1 isoform blocker. Instead, it is a type 1 blocker in rodents. So rodent studies using high doses of finasteride aren't applicable to human beings. Even though dutasteride has type 1 blocking effects, it is still a stronger type 2 blocker than a type 1 blocker. I showed that there is very little evidence that either finasteride or dutasteride at normal human doses has much of an effect on brain neurosteroid levels. There is also very little scientific evidence that either of those drugs can cause depression, and the only reason depression was even added as a side effect of finasteride was to stave off litigation from the money-hungry PFS network. After all, if depression really were a side effect of finasteride, then why wouldn't dutasteride, which is a more powerful drug, not also get this update? It's a sad reality, but the fact is that sometimes drug manufacturers will list fake side effects and symptoms just to avoid litigation, because judges and juries are not always scientifically literate and can be swayed through the emotional arguments organizations like the PFS network like to make. Next, I show that there are several mental health disorders that are partly androgen-related and made worse by the trash hormone DHT. These include Parkinson's disease, schizophrenia, and Tourette syndrome. There is evidence that 5-AR blockers can help people with these mental health conditions. In today's video, I showed that 5-AR blockers could be helpful for treating alcohol and opioid addiction. Also, 5-AR blockers may help PMS. Additionally, I just showed data that finasteride at very high doses may even help treat a certain type of malignant brain tumor known as glioblastoma. So if you look at all the terrible forums and subreddits out there dedicated to the subject of hair loss, you'd probably get the idea that 5-AR blockers do nothing but bad things to steroids in the brain like cause depression. Even if that were true, it's most likely 5-AR blockers have saved many more people from depression than any depression side effect from finasteride or dutasteride. There is in fact objective data out there that shows that going bald can completely destroy your life, and I made a video about that which I'll link below, which I highly recommend you watch because people greatly underestimate the social damage that hair loss actually causes. If you are avoiding finasteride because of a fear about side effects, you are making a huge mistake. And that's not just my opinion. This has been factually verified. So as I've shown, there are many beneficial effects of 5-AR blockers, not just for stopping hair loss, but also for treating disorders of neurological function. But you won't read any of that on the hair loss forums because those idiots are all convinced that finasteride will make their dick fall off and that they can cure their hair loss by eating broccoli. Trust me, Chooms, there is no bigger threat to your hair than online disinformation, and the best way to protect yourself from these dangers is to properly educate yourself about the actual science behind hair loss, and that is what my channel is here to help you do. So we'll be back with more preem deets on fighting the slaphead curse soon, so until then, good luck on the path, my fellow hair loss witchers. Take care.